What happens in the final moments of a condemned man's life? From whispered confessions to chilling denials, Tennessee's death chamber has heard it all. This video uncovers the haunting stories behind all 14 executions carried out in the state from 1976 to 2025. Crimes, last meals, final words, and methods. Stay with us as we walk through these unforgettable endings. 1. Robert Glenn Coe, executed. April 19, 2000. It started with a lie. A southern Tennessee town was torn open on September 1, 1979, when 8-year-old Carrie Ann Medlin vanished on her way home. Witnesses reported seeing her get into a car driven by Robert Glenn Coe, a former mental patient with a history of sexual deviance and a troubled past soaked in drugs, neglect, and rage. When police tracked him down, Coe's story shifted with every breath, first denying, then claiming divine voices had guided his actions. He eventually confessed, stating he'd lured the girl with a story about a puppy, then raped and killed her in a remote area. His trial became a flashpoint for capital punishment in Tennessee. Despite multiple appeals citing his mental health, a jury handed down a death sentence. It would take more than 2 decades of legal wrangling before his execution was finalized. On the day of his execution, Robert Glenn Coe ate a final meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, buttered rolls, and pecan pie. His last words were nearly inaudible. "I'm just sorry, so sorry." As the lethal injection coursed through his veins at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Tennessee, resumed executions for the first time in 40 years. The cocktail that ended his life was delivered in silence. No last-minute pleas, no last-minute miracles. Just the hum of machines and a family left broken. 2. Sedley Alli, executed June 28, 2006. Sedley Alli's crime was so gruesome, many questioned how such brutality could live behind the face of a seemingly average man. In July 1985, 19-year-old Marine Lance Corporal Suzanne Marie Collins went jogging near her base in Millington. She never came back. Her body was discovered hours later, beaten, sexually assaulted, and impaled. Witnesses spotted a suspicious vehicle near the crime scene, and it wasn't long before investigators linked it to Alli, who initially denied any involvement. When faced with mounting evidence, Alli confessed, but his confession didn't match key forensic details, sparking decades of debate. Attorneys later argued that he had been pressured, that DNA might exonerate him. Courts repeatedly denied new testing, and the execution moved forward amid protests from innocence advocates. Hours before his death, Sedley Alli ate a final meal of a cheeseburger, baked beans, and a cherry Coke. As he lay strapped to the gurney, his last words stunned those present. "I am innocent. The state is murdering an innocent man." At 1:30 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. Despite ongoing debates over his guilt, Alli's case became a lightning rod for the conversation around DNA access and potential wrongful execution in America. 3. Philip Ray Workman, executed May 9, 2007. A botched robbery, a fallen officer, and a nation divided over justice. In 1981, Philip Workman walked into a Wendy's in Memphis with a gun. The robbery spiraled into chaos, and police officer Lieutenant Ronald Oliver was shot and killed during the takedown. Workman was arrested almost immediately and claimed he never fired the fatal shot, suggesting crossfire from other officers caused Oliver's death. Ballistics evidence remained controversial, and experts later stated the bullet might not have come from Workman's weapon. Nevertheless, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Over the next 2 decades, his case became a magnet for media and human rights activists. Even surviving members of the victim's family called for clemency, citing flawed forensics and doubts about Workman's guilt. On his final day, Philip Workman made an unusual request. He declined a personal last meal and asked instead for a vegetarian pizza to be given to a homeless person in Nashville. The state denied the request. His last words were calm. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I forgive everyone, and I hope everyone forgives me." He died by lethal injection. No media soundbites followed, just a cold final act in a case that haunted Tennessee's conscience. 4. Daryl Holton, executed. September 12, 2007. No crime better encapsulated pure horror than that of Daryl Holton, a Gulf War veteran who took the lives of his own children. In 1997, Holton picked up his 3 sons and daughter from his ex-wife for what should have been a routine visit. He then drove them to his auto repair shop in Shelbyville, lined them up, and shot them one by one with a semi-automatic rifle. Authorities found the children's bodies carefully placed and covered with sheets. When arrested, Holton didn't resist. He told officers exactly what he had done and why, claiming he wanted to save them from the pain of a broken home. Diagnosed with mental illness, Holton nonetheless waived his appeals and chose execution by electrocution, becoming the first person in Tennessee to die that way in 47 years. For his last meal, Holton requested pizza, steak, and a large soda. In his final words, he simply stated, 2 words, "I'm sorry." As the switch was pulled and 1,750 volts surged through his body, the past was not erased, but for a moment it was quiet. Some saw justice, others saw a father too broken for redemption. 5. Steve Henley, executed February 4, 2009. It was the kind of crime that silenced a small town. In 1985, in rural Jackson County, an elderly couple, Fred and Edna Stafford, were found burned alive inside their home. The fire had been set intentionally, but it was no accident. It was murder meant to hide something darker. The couple had been shot before the blaze consumed the evidence. Investigators turned to Steve Henley, a man who'd previously lived with the Staffords and had reportedly harbored resentment toward them over a dispute. Henley denied any involvement. He said he had no motive, no reason to kill. But witnesses claimed he had talked about robbing the couple, and circumstantial evidence stacked against him. At trial, his defense pointed to the weakness of the prosecution's case, yet the jury wasn't convinced. In 1986, Henley was sentenced to die. For over 2 decades, Henley insisted he was innocent. Activists rallied behind his case, calling for a re-examination of the evidence. But courts upheld the verdict, and the governor signed the final order. On the night of his execution, Henley declined a special last meal, opting instead for the prison's regular menu, baked chicken, green beans, and cornbread. Before the lethal injection began, Henley's final words were a quiet but firm denial. "I didn't kill them, but I forgive you all." The drugs entered his bloodstream at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. There were no delays, no last-minute stays, just a life extinguished, and a case that left more questions than answers for many. 6. Ceil Johnson, executed December 2, 2009. Ceil Johnson was just 18 when he stepped into a Nashville convenience store one summer night in 1980 and unleashed chaos that would echo for nearly 30 years. Armed and nervous, he was there to rob the place, but when it was over, 3 men were dead: Bobby Bell Jr., James Moore, and Charles House. Witnesses placed Johnson at the scene, and his own cousin testified against him. Still, questions lingered over who actually pulled the trigger. Johnson claimed he was part of the robbery but didn't commit the killings. At trial, Prosecutors painted him as a ruthless teen who fired without mercy. The defense argued the testimony was unreliable and that Johnson was being punished for his silence rather than hard proof. He was sentenced to death. Over the years, his legal team filed appeals citing racial bias and a lack of forensic evidence tying him to the gun. But the court stood firm. In the final hours before execution, Johnson was visited by family. For his last meal, he requested fried fish, hush puppies, and a slice of chocolate cake. When brought to the gurney, he looked up and spoke slowly. "I am not the person who did this. I forgive all of you. May God have mercy." At 1:34 a.m., the drugs flowed. Johnson became the first African American executed in Tennessee in the modern era. His case, like many others, still stirs debate about race, youth, and justice. 7. Billy Ray Irick, executed August 9, 2018. He was the man who babysat the children. He ate dinner at their table. And then one night in 1985, he shattered that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Billy Ray Irick raped and murdered 7-year-old Paula Dyer while babysitting her for family friends in Knoxville. He called 911 himself after the act, but claimed the girl had simply stopped breathing. The truth would later reveal itself in medical reports that described unspeakable trauma. Irick had a long history of mental illness. His defense argued he wasn't competent to stand trial, but the court disagreed, and the jury returned a death sentence. For over 30 years, Irick remained on death row, his case delayed again and again by questions about his psychological state and Tennessee's lethal injection protocol. In the final moments, Irick showed little emotion. His last meal consisted of a burger, onion rings, and a root beer. Just before the execution began, he mumbled his last words, "I just want to say I'm sorry." The lethal injection didn't go smoothly. Witnesses described him coughing, gasping. Advocacy groups called it torture, but the state deemed it complete. A case that began with a child's cry ended in a silent chamber, haunted by ethical questions. 8. Edmund Zagorski, executed November 1, 2018. The trap was simple. Edmund Zagorski promised two men he could sell them 100 pounds of marijuana. They met in a wooded area in Robertson County in April 1983, expecting a deal. What they got instead was execution-style murder. Zagorski shot John Dotson and Jimmy Porter in the head, slit their throats, and left their bodies to rot in the underbrush. He fled, but not for long. Zagorski's capture led to a trial that gripped the state. The evidence was overwhelming: ballistics, blood-stained clothes, witness statements. He was convicted swiftly. But Zagorski didn't fade into the background on death row. Instead, he made headlines in 2018 when he opted for the electric chair over lethal injection, citing concerns about the state's drug protocol. He believed electrocution, while brutal, would be quicker and less painful. His last meal? Pickled pig's feet and pigtails. He smiled when he was strapped to the chair. His last words were, "Let's rock." And then 1,750 volts surged through his body. He was pronounced dead minutes later. His death sparked debate not only about method, but about whether death, in any form, could truly be humane. 9. David Earl Miller, executed December 6, 2018. She was kind. She had developmental disabilities. She trusted him. And in May 1981, Lee Standifer paid the price for that trust. The 23-year-old was found beaten, raped, and murdered in Knoxville. David Earl Miller, a drifter from Ohio with a violent past, had been dating her for several weeks. The night of the murder, he reportedly flew into a rage during an argument. He beat her with a fire poker until her skull fractured, then dragged her lifeless body into the woods and left her beneath the trees like garbage. Miller fled but was quickly tracked down. The evidence was undeniable. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. But his appeals stretched across decades, challenging ineffective counsel, his abusive childhood, and his mental health. Still, the court stood firm. The horror of what he did never faded. Miller chose electrocution over lethal injection, becoming the second inmate in Tennessee to make that choice in decades. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and biscuits, Southern comfort for a man facing a barbaric end. Witnesses said he appeared calm, almost relieved. His last words were spoken softly. "I've made peace. I hope she has too." At 7:25 p.m., electricity jolted through his body. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, but the machine did its work. Justice, some would say, had finally caught up to the monster in the woods. 10. Donnie Edward Johnson, executed, May 16, 2019. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear the face of someone who says, "I do." Donnie Johnson was a church-going family man, a religious counselor in prison, and a killer who suffocated his wife with a plastic bag in 1984. He killed her in their car behind a warehouse, staged the scene as a robbery, and even convinced his stepson to help him dispose of the body. He returned to work the same day, acting like nothing had happened. It didn't take long for investigators to see through the lie. His stepson eventually confessed and exposed Johnson's role in the murder. The betrayal shocked the community. How could a man kill the woman who bore his child and then carry on as if she were disposable? Johnson's trial ended with a death sentence. But what followed was a decades-long transformation. In prison, he became a Seventh-day Adventist minister, baptized other inmates, and led Bible studies. His supporters pleaded for clemency, citing genuine reform. Even his daughter asked the governor to spare his life. But the state moved forward. For his final meal, Johnson declined food and instead fasted in honor of his faith. His last words reflected his spiritual path. "I commend my spirit into your hands, O Lord." At 7:37 p.m., the chemicals flowed. There were no outbursts, just a quiet end for a man who claimed redemption, but whose crime left an unhealable scar. 11. Stephen Michael West, executed August 15, 2019. Union County, 1986. A mother and her teenage daughter were abducted from their home. The bodies of Wanda Romains and her 15-year-old daughter Sheila were later discovered in the woods, stabbed, tortured, and mutilated. Stephen Michael West was arrested alongside Ronnie Martin, a 17-year-old accomplice. Both men confessed, but both blamed the other for the killings. According to West, Martin initiated the attack and committed the rape. Prosecutors saw it differently. They said West orchestrated everything. The brutality of the crime made it one of the most shocking in Tennessee history. West was sentenced to death while Martin, being a juvenile, received life. Over the years, West's lawyers argued that he suffered from severe mental illness and that his execution would be inhumane. They also pushed for clemency, citing that Martin may have been the real killer. But in the eyes of the court, West's hands were soaked in the same blood. In his final hours, West requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a dessert cobbler. He was given a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair. He chose electrocution, making him the third inmate in recent years to do so. As the straps were fastened and the black mask lowered, he whispered, "I'm sorry. I pray they rest in peace." When the switch flipped, 1,750 volts burned through his body, and the darkness returned to a case that had begun with screams in the night. 12th Lee Hall, executed December 5, 2019. The match that lit the fire was fueled by jealousy. In 1991, Lee Hall, legally blind and simmering with rage, set his ex-girlfriend Tracy Crozier's car ablaze while she sat inside. She managed to escape, screaming in pain with burns covering 90% of her body. She survived for a day before succumbing to her injuries in a hospital bed. Her final hours were agony. The attack came after a stormy relationship in which Crozier had tried to distance herself from Hall, but he wouldn't let her go. Hall's defense pointed to his visual impairment and claimed the fire was never meant to be deadly, but the jury didn't believe it. They saw it as premeditated: the gasoline, the match, the trap. In 1992, he was sentenced to death. Over the next 2 decades, appeals poured in, from advocates citing his blindness to activists warning against executing the disabled. But the courts stayed the course. When the execution date arrived, Hall opted for a familiar Southern final meal: fried pork chops, macaroni and cheese, biscuits, and peach pie. As he was strapped into the electric chair, the same device used in prior executions, he spoke calmly. "I hope you find peace. I'm sorry for the pain." At 7:26 p.m., electricity tore through his body, and Lee Hall became Tennessee's 4th execution by electrocution in a year. Outside, some mourned. Others called it overdue justice. 13. Nicholas Todd Sutton. Executed February 20, 2020. He killed his own grandmother at age 18 and buried her in a shallow grave behind her Tennessee home. But that wasn't the end of Nicholas Sutton's rampage. Over the next few years, he murdered 2 close friends and a fellow inmate while in prison. Sutton seemed born to violence: charming, intelligent, but haunted by a deeply disturbed mind. In 1985, he stabbed fellow inmate Carl Estep 38 times in a dispute over drugs and debts inside the Morgan County Prison. That murder earned him a death sentence. Yet, over the decades, something unexpected happened. Sutton changed. He saved a prison guard from being stabbed by other inmates. He pulled another from a burning cell. Fellow inmates spoke of his compassion and spiritual growth. 5 correctional officers signed letters asking for clemency, describing him as a man who had redeemed himself. But despite the growing support, the governor refused to stay. For his last meal, Sutton requested fried pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, peach pie, and sweet tea. His final words were drenched in both sorrow and serenity. "I'm just grateful for every moment. To those I hurt, I am truly sorry." At 7:26 p.m., electricity sealed his fate. For some, Sutton died a monster. For others, a man reborn. 14th Oscar Franklin Smith, executed May 22, 2025. He insisted on his innocence until the very end, but the crime scene painted a picture of rage and revenge. In 1989, Judith Lynn Smith and her 2 sons, Chad and Jason Burnett, were found brutally murdered in their Nashville home. Each had been stabbed, shot, or bludgeoned. Oscar Franklin Smith, Judith's estranged husband, was quickly arrested. The motive? A bitter divorce, custody battles, and resentment that had boiled over. The trial was built on circumstantial evidence and a bloody palm print the state claimed was Smith's. For years, he argued it wasn't. DNA challenges and appeals followed. In 2022, his lawyers filed for reprieve based on new testing that could potentially exonerate him, but the courts denied a stay. To the state, the case was closed. To others, it remained full of holes. Smith's execution had been scheduled and delayed multiple times, but in May 2025 the date finally stuck. He chose a traditional Southern final meal: meatloaf, cornbread, green beans, and apple pie. As he lay strapped down, he looked toward the witness room and said, "I did not do this. I am innocent. May God judge us all." The lethal injection was administered. By 8:17 p.m., Oscar Franklin Smith was pronounced dead. His was the last execution in Tennessee as of 2025, a case that continues to divide. From revenge-fueled flames to crimes born of desperation, Tennessee's executed prisoners left behind scorched lives, unanswered questions, and grieving families. Their last words echo in chambers of silence, some begging forgiveness, others claiming innocence. In the end, the state rendered its final judgment, and history etched their names in the ledger of the condemned.